Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Mercer had said to the attending physicians during his morning briefing, his voice carrying the particular contempt reserved for those without credentials framed on mahogany. Natalie Hayes didn't hear him say it, not directly, but she felt the way the room's energy shifted when someone reduced 8 years of combat medicine and 3 deployments to a title printed on a hospital badge. They didn't know who was walking their corridors at 6 a.m., standing in the pediatric wing of St. Michael's in Savannah, her hand steady as she prepared Matthew Pierce's morning medications. They had no idea what she'd already survived. What happened next would change the trajectory of a child's life and end a career before anyone understood who she really was. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical rhythm overhead as Natalie moved through the pediatric ward at St. Michael's, her movements efficient and quiet. 7 months she'd been working this floor, 7 months of night shifts and impossible cases, of watching children fight battles no one that small should have to fight. The hospital smelled like every hospital, antiseptic layered over something indefinably sick, the chemical bleach that never quite masked human suffering. Her shoes made soft clicking sounds on the tile floor, a rhythm she'd learned to match to the pulse of the building itself. Somewhere down the corridor, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical breath. Somewhere else, a monitor beeped its steady count of a heartbeat that had decided to keep going. Matthew Pierce's room was at the end of the east wing, room 847, overlooking the courtyard where magnolia trees dropped their waxy petals onto concrete. The boy lay in his hospital bed, 7 years old, profoundly deaf since birth, his small frame looking impossibly fragile beneath the white sheets. The deafness wasn't his crisis, it had never been his crisis. The crisis was everything else that had started failing over the past 3 weeks, the way his body had begun its quiet rebellion. Natalie had learned early in her career that children often told you the truth before they even knew they were doing it. You just had to listen with more than your ears. Colonel James Pierce sat in the bedside chair, the same place he'd occupied for the past 18 days since Matthew had been admitted. The man was in his mid-50s, built like something carved from concrete and intention, with the kind of posture that came from standing at attention for 3 decades. His dress uniform hung on a hook in the corner, Air Force blues, pressed to an edge that could cut. He wore civilian clothes now, jeans and a plain grey t-shirt, looking somehow more dangerous without the uniform's official sanction. Both hands rested on his thighs. His eyes tracked every movement in the room with the focused attention of someone trained to notice when details shifted. When Natalie entered with her medication cart, his gaze locked onto her like a targeting system acquiring a lock. "Good morning, Colonel," she said, her voice soft but present. "Matthew's getting breakfast in 20 minutes. I need to check his lines." The Colonel nodded once, a sharp military gesture. His hands moved automatically, practice movement, as he stood and stepped back to give her room. He didn't leave, though. They never left. Natalie had learned that about parents in intensive care. They stood vigil the way soldiers stood watch, as if their presence alone could hold back what was coming. Matthew's left arm lay across the white sheet, the four secured with medical tape at the crook of his elbow. Natalie's hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this thousands of times before, checking the line for infiltration, ensuring the catheter hadn't twisted, verifying that the medication was flowing the direction it was supposed to go. As she worked, her eyes tracked other details. The slight rise and fall of the boy's chest. The oxygen saturation monitor glowing softly on the bedside table. The ventilator that wasn't there, not yet, but existed in the probability space of what might need to happen if the next 72 hours went badly. 15 specialists had already cycled through Matthew's case. 15 doctors in white coats and starched ties, each one delivering variations of the same assessment. The boy's anxiety was manifesting as respiratory symptoms. The deafness had left him isolated, the specialists explained, and isolation created stress, and stress created the appearance of lung function deterioration that wasn't actually there. Anxiety-related. Psychosomatic. Treatable with psychiatric evaluation and anti-anxiety medication. The Colonel had listened to each one with the same expression, a military man processing intelligence that didn't align with tactical reality. He'd paid for private consultations. He'd brought in specialists from Atlanta, from Charleston. They'd all reached the same conclusion because they weren't listening to the same thing Natalie was listening to. She returned to the nurse's station with her handwritten notes, settling into the chair at the curved desk where 3 monitors displayed rolling vital signs and patient histories in glowing text. The station smelled like stale coffee, the kind that had been brewing since 5 a.m., dark enough to be dangerous. Natalie opened Matthew's chart and began documenting what she'd observed, her handwriting precise and clinical. The boy's oxygen saturation had dropped 3 percentage points since her last shift. His respiratory rate had increased by 4 breaths per minute. The little expiratory wheeze she'd first noticed last week was deepening into something more substantial, something with weight. Most of the notes from the specialists were clinical summaries. Anxiety. Possible conversion disorder. Recommend psychiatric evaluation. Mercer had added his own notation just yesterday, nursing observations inconsistent with clinical findings. Reassess baseline. The dismissal was elegant, almost gentle, if you didn't know how to read what was really being said. What it actually meant was, the nurse is unreliable, her observations can be discounted, her assessment of this patient's trajectory does not align with the conclusions of trained physicians. The retired combat medic found her near the supply closet on the 2nd floor, where she'd gone to restock the 4 kits. His name was on her periphery, a visitor badge clipped to a blue polo shirt, the kind of casual attire that usually belonged to a grandfather visiting someone's newborn. But there was something else underneath the civilian clothes, something in the way he moved through the hallway with territorial awareness, the way his eyes registered exits and sightlines. You repositioning that for? He asked quietly, not quite approaching, giving her space the way someone did when they were trained to understand the calculus of personal space and threat distance. Natalie looked up from her task, her hands continuing their work. She'd been adjusting Matthews for line earlier, ensuring the catheter wasn't bent, checking for any position that might restrict flow. The technique was 3-point stabilization, a method she'd learned on a forward surgical team operating at Forward Operating Base Shank in Loga Province, taught by a field medic named Gomez who'd since taken a bullet in the femoral artery and bled out before they could get him to the trauma bird. It was a technique most hospital nurses never needed to learn because they weren't working in places where 4 lines had to survive rapid movement and medical evacuation. Just checking placement, Natalie said, returning her full attention to the cabinet. Her hands moved on their own, assembling the restocking, gauze, alcohol prep pads, the small sharps containers marked with biohazard symbols. The man watched her for another few seconds, then walked away without another word. But his eyes had changed something in the air around him, the way a predator changes the air when it recognizes another predator. Natalie finished her restocking and returned to the ward, where the fluorescent lights continued their mechanical hum and the hospital continued its endless work of trying to hold the line between living and not. Dr. Mercer arrived for morning rounds at 7:41 a.m., his entrance marked by a shift in atmospheric pressure that Natalie felt more than saw. He was tall, with a kind of bone structure that spoke of generational wealth and private schools, his white coat pristine despite being worn by someone who apparently didn't actually interact with patients in ways that could compromise fabric. Behind him trailed the attending physicians and residents, a hierarchy of credentials arranged by rank. He reviewed Matthew Pierce's chart first, moving through the pages with the mechanical efficiency of someone reading for evidence to support a predetermined conclusion. His eyes passed over Natalie's careful documentation without pause, the way a reader skipped advertisements in a magazine. When he looked up from the chart, his gaze found her positioned at the edge of the room, where she stood with her arms at ease but her posture aligned with military precision. "How is our anxious young man this morning?" he asked, directing the question toward Colonel Pierce as if Natalie was furniture. "Same," the colonel said, his voice controlled. "The respiratory changes continue. She's been documenting them." He glanced toward Natalie, a small gesture that shifted the room's attention in her direction. Mercer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The breathing changes are consistent with anxiety manifestation. The psychiatry consultation will clarify the underlying etiology." He made a note in the chart, his handwriting as precise as surgical incision. "Continue current medications. No changes to the respiratory protocols at this time." The resident closest to him, a young man with nervous hands and a stethoscope that caught the light, nodded and wrote down the instructions as if they were gospel delivered from on high. None of them looked at Matthew. None of them asked the boy a single question, despite the notepad and pen sitting on the bedside table that the colonel sometimes used to write messages the boy could read. Natalie stood completely still, her face a neutral surface, her jaw relaxed, her hands at her sides. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the precise calibration of restraint, the military version of self-control that felt like standing at attention while someone methodically disassembled your credibility. She didn't flinch. She didn't change her breathing. She watched the group file out of the room, Mercer leading, and then she returned to her documentation as if the morning rounds had never happened. The chart notes lay on the stainless steel table during grand rounds, and Dr. Mercer held them up like evidence of fraud. Morning light caught the edge of his wedding band as he turned the pages slowly, deliberately, letting every resident in the room see Natalie's handwriting. 30 seconds of silence. The kind that tastes like metal. "Observe," he said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who had never been questioned. "We have here a perfect example of nursing overreach. Pages of speculation. Pages of clinical opinion masquerading as observation." He let the papers fall onto the table. They scattered across the polished surface. "Ms. Hayes has documented, and I quote, concerning patterns in respiratory function suggesting early compensatory fatigue." Concerning patterns. As if a nurse with 6 weeks of battlefield training can diagnose what 15 pediatric specialists have already evaluated. The resident stared at their shoes. At the ceiling. Anywhere but at Natalie, who stood at the back of the group with her hands folded, her expression the color of drywall. Expressionless. Untouched. "The child has anxiety," Mercer continued, lifting his eyes to find her in the crowd. "He found her. His mother died 3 years ago. His father left him with us while he played soldier overseas. Of course the boy is anxious. A first-year resident could diagnose that. But our Miss Hayes has decided that 15 board-certified physicians, 15, have somehow missed a pulmonary crisis." He smiled. "It wasn't warm. We will not be pursuing her recommendations. We will continue with the established treatment protocol." "Understood." The residents nodded. They always did. Natalie's jaw moved once, a single muscle contraction, then settled back into stillness. Her eyes had gone the color of winter water. She made a note on her iPad, something about medication timing, something clinical and necessary, and turned toward the door. Steady breathing. Steady hands. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. What they didn't know was how close the steel under her fingertips had come that morning. How she'd stood outside Matthew's room at 5:27 a.m. and watched the boy's chest work harder than it should. How his oxygen saturation had dipped to 91% during sleep. How the pattern in his breathing had the exact signature of early sepsis or pneumonia beginning its climb. 15 specialists. None of them had noticed because they weren't watching. Not really. Mercer had trained them not to. He had trained the entire floor to see what he wanted them to see, an anxious deaf child, not a child in medical danger. She returned to Matthew's room. The boy was awake now, propped against pillows, his thin fingers working through a plastic puzzle. Colonel Pierce sat in the visitor's chair, reading something on his phone, the stress carved into the lines around his eyes like a map of sleepless nights. He looked up as Natalie entered. "Morning rounds went well?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. He always knew. "Fine. Everything's on schedule." She moved to the monitors, checking the numbers, writing them down. "Routine. Clinical. Professional. How's his appetite this morning?" "Wouldn't eat." Said his chest felt tight. Natalie's hands didn't pause. "Tight how?" "Wouldn't explain it. You know how he is with sounds. Sometimes I think he can hear them, just doesn't want to." She nodded and made another note. "Tight chest. Elevated respiratory rate. Oxygen dipping during sleep. Mercer had documented none of it because Mercer didn't believe in it. Because Natalie was the one observing, and Natalie was, according to the implicit hierarchy of St. Michael's, nobody. For hours later, she stood in the supply closet reaching for sterile gauze, and that's when her hands found the steel shelf. Cold. Smooth. Real. She gripped it, one hand on each side, and her knuckles did what they had to do, they went white. The rest of her stayed perfect. Shoulders level. Breathing even. But her hands understood what her face could not show, the fury of watching a child deteriorate while grown men with diplomas dismissed the evidence. She counted to 12. Then she released the shelf and returned to Matthew's room. The second confrontation came during the afternoon medication distribution. Mercer was reviewing cases with two attending physicians, Dr. Sarah Lakewood and Dr. James Patterson, both of them good clinicians who had learned not to contradict the chief. Natalie was hanging a new fur bag when Mercer's voice cut across the hallway like a blade. "Ms. Hayes." Perfect timing. He gestured to the attendings. "These doctors were just asking me about your medical recommendations in the Pierce file. I explained to them that while your observations are appreciated, they fall outside your scope of practice. Hospital Policy Section 7.3.2 is quite clear. Nurses document observations. Physicians interpret them. Nurses do not diagnose. Nurses do not recommend treatment modifications." Natalie finished securing the four-line. Her hands moved with absolute precision, each motion deliberate and smooth. "Is that understood?" Mercer asked. "Yes, doctor." Her voice was quiet. Not meek, quiet was different. Quiet had weight. "Good. Because I've had several concerns brought to my attention about your chart entries. Implied clinical judgments. Suggestions of expertise you simply do not possess. It's important that we maintain professional boundaries here at St. Michael's. For the patient's sake." Dr. Lakewood shifted her weight, uncomfortable. Dr. Patterson studied the floor tiles. Natalie turned to face them all. Her eyes were steady, but something had changed behind them, a slight hardening at the edges, like ice beginning to form. "Is there anything else, doctor?" "No. Just maintain your lane, please." She nodded once and moved down the hallway, back to Matthew's room, back to the monitors that would tell her everything the specialists couldn't be bothered to read. Mercer watched her go. He had been expecting tears, or defensiveness, or anger. Instead he had gotten compliance. It frustrated him in ways he couldn't articulate. The woman was supposed to break. Good people always broke eventually. Good people with something to hide broke fastest. But Natalie Hayes did not break. The third confrontation was orchestrated with care. Mercer positioned himself at the entrance to the stairwell on the pediatric ward at 2:13 p.m., flanked by two residents and Dr. Patricia Vance, no relation to the legendary physician of the same name, but the coincidence delighted him. He had timed this perfectly. Matthew's father had stepped out for coffee. Natalie was alone on the unit. She came around the corner with a fresh bag of saline, and Mercer stepped directly into her path. "Ms. Hayes." "A moment." He gestured to his entourage. "These residents are reviewing case protocols. I wanted to clarify something about your documentation in the Pierce file. Specifically, your note from this morning about concerning patterns." Natalie's expression did not change. She waited. "You wrote that you were concerned." "Not observing." "Concerned." That's a medical interpretation. That requires clinical judgment. That is diagnosis. Do you understand the distinction?" "Yes, doctor." "And yet you documented it anyway. In a hospital where nurses do not make diagnoses. Where nurses do not exceed their scope of practice." He paused, letting the silence settle. "Where nurses who violate this policy face disciplinary action. Do I need to involve security in this conversation, or do we have an understanding?" The two residents watched with expressions that had learned not to feel. Dr. Vance looked genuinely uncomfortable, but she said nothing. Natalie stood with the saline bag in her hands, her weight balanced evenly on both feet, her breathing unchanged. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet the residents had to lean forward to hear it. "I document what I observe. Matthew Pierce's oxygen saturation has declined from 96% baseline to 91% during sleep. His respiratory rate has increased from 18 to 26 breaths per minute. His color during exertion is grayish instead of pink. These are objective measurements. Not interpretations. Not diagnoses. Facts. That you interpret as concerning," Mercer said. "That any trained clinician would recognize as requiring evaluation." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Mercer smiled, and his smile was the worst thing Natalie had seen in months, not because it was angry, but because it was satisfied. He had what he needed. Documentation of insubordination. A nurse contradicting a physician. Residents as witnesses. "Thank you for clarifying your understanding of hospital protocol," he said quietly. "I'll be making note of this conversation." Natalie nodded once and moved past him down the hallway. She did not run. She did not hurry. She walked with the steady precision of someone who had walked through far worse. Behind her, she heard Mercer beginning to speak to the residents, his voice taking on the tone of gentle concern, the tone of a mentor explaining why good people sometimes had to be removed from the hospital for everyone's safety. She reached Matthew's room. The boy was sleeping, his chest rising and falling at the elevated rate she had documented. 16 hours to midnight. 16 hours until the night shift, when the skeleton crew would be skeleton crew, when only the nurses would be watching, when a child in crisis would have only the people Mercer had trained himself to despise standing between him and the darkness. She sat down in the chair beside the bed and opened her laptop. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining pressed against her ribs, faded now, almost invisible, but still there. Still real. She had come to St. Michael's to watch Colonel Pierce. Instead she was watching his son decline while a man with institutional authority and a medical degree systematically dismantled her ability to help him. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Mercer had no idea what he was doing. He was playing chess with someone who had learned the game in the desert, in conditions that would have broken him in 48 hours. He was trying to destroy a woman who had already been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that destruction had become just another procedure to endure. At 2:38 a.m., Matthew's monitors began to alarm. The monitors began to sing their warning song at 2:38 a.m. One beep. Then another. Then a rhythm that meant nothing good. Natalie was 2 floors up, finishing the intake on a pneumonia admission, when her pager buzzed. She didn't run. Running drew attention. She walked, measured, purposeful, back down to the pediatric wing where the fluorescent lights cast everything in a sickly blue-white that made children look like they were already half gone. Matthew's door was still closed. Good. That meant no one had panicked yet, which meant she had maybe 90 seconds before a cascade of staff descended like vultures. She pushed through quietly. The boy lay rigid against his pillows, his small chest heaving in short, desperate pulls for air that wasn't coming. His lips had gone the color of old bruises. The ventilator hummed its mechanical rhythm, but something was wrong, deeply, catastrophically wrong. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 89, 87. 85. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung with air trapped in the pleural space, compressing the heart. It happened sometimes in children with compromised lung tissue. It happened when your body decided to betray you. 15 specialists had dismissed Matthew's deteriorating function as anxiety. 15 doctors who saw a deaf child and assumed the problem was psychological, not mechanical. Natalie's hand moved to her pager and didn't press it. She crossed the room in 3 steps. Her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the one she'd worn under her scrubs for 4 years straight, hung on the back of the chair. She unzipped her pocket without breaking stride. The 14-gauge needle was there, where it always was. Sterile. Ready. Muscle memory from a trauma bay in Ramadi where the nearest surgical team was 30 kilometers away and children bled out on concrete floors. Matthew. Her voice dropped an octave. I need you very still. She didn't wait for his nod. She didn't need it. She palpated the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the sweet spot where air liked to hide. Her fingers knew this anatomy the way a pianist knows the keys. The skin was thin here. Easy. Quick. She prepped with an alcohol swab, her hands moving like they belonged to someone else, someone who had done this before in places where sterilization was a concept and survival was the only metric that mattered. The needle went in. Angled. Sure. The hiss filled the room like a sigh of relief. That sound. She would never not know that sound. The sound of pressure releasing, of a body realizing it could breathe again. Air escaping. Oxygen saturation climbing. 75, 77. 79. Matthew's eyes went wide, but not from pain. From relief. From the sudden, shocked realization that his lungs had remembered how to work. 82, 85. 88. His color was returning. Pink creeping back into his cheeks. His small hands unclenching from the sheets. 91. Stable. Natalie secured the needle with tape from the supply cart, the motions automatic, practiced, the kind of precise sequence that only came from doing it 100 times under fire. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She checked his pupils, his breath sounds, the monitor readout that now read like a normal child instead of a child drowning in his own chest cavity. 15 minutes passed. Maybe 20. Time moved differently when you were operating on instinct. The door burst open at 2:51 a.m. Dr. Mercer stopped in the threshold. His face went through a sequence of colors, surprise, confusion, then a purple that started at his neck and climbed toward his hairline. His eyes locked onto the needle secured against Matthew's ribs, the tape, Natalie's steady hands, the oxygen saturation reading that now climbed into the low 90s like a mountain she'd just summoned into existence. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. What did you do? His voice was quiet. Dangerous. The voice of a man whose entire hierarchy had just been reorganized in a single moment. Needle decompression. Natalie's tone was flat, clinical. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The tension was causing. I don't care what caused it. He moved to Matthew's bedside, his presence displacing air like a thing with weight. You performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. You have a nursing license. Not a medical degree. He was deoxygenating. That's not your decision to make. His oxygen saturation was 84 and falling. His lips were cyanotic. His heart rate was 168. Each fact was a sentence. Each sentence was a weapon. You want me to wait for authorization while he goes into cardiac arrest? The room had gone quiet except for the steady beep of the monitor, the ventilator's mechanical exhale, the soft sound of a child breathing in oxygen again. Dr. Mercer's hands were trembling. Not from fear. From rage. From the recognition that he'd just walked into a moment where the hierarchy he'd constructed so carefully had revealed itself to be made of paper. This woman, this nurse with the military bearing and the hands that moved like she'd held together the dying before, had just outmaneuvered 15 specialists and him in the span of 90 seconds. He pulled out his phone. His fingers jabbed at the screen. Hard enough that she heard the keyboard clicks from across the room. I'm filing a formal complaint with the State Nursing Association, he said, his voice steady now, controlled, the rage compartmentalized into something systematic and bureaucratic. Hospital Policy Section 7.3.2 explicitly prohibits nursing staff from performing invasive procedures without physician authorization, regardless of circumstances. His oxygen. I don't care. He held up a hand. I will be recommending immediate suspension pending a full investigation. Risk management will hear about this. The board will hear about this. and you will be escorted from this hospital by security within the hour. He turned to leave, paused at the door. Just a nurse, he said quietly. Remember that when they revoke your license. He left before she could respond. Natalie looked at Matthew. His chest was rising and falling with the steady rhythm of a child whose body had remembered it could breathe. The monitor beeped its healthy rhythm. His oxygen saturation held steady at 92. She began documenting the procedure in the chart with the same precise handwriting that had filled medical reports in trauma bays across 3 continents. Time, 2:38 a.m. Chief complaint, sudden deterioration, suspected tension pneumothorax. Procedure, needle decompression with 14-gauge angiocath. Outcome, immediate improvement in oxygenation and respiratory effort. The documentation was flawless because documentation from someone who had run field triage in Ramadi was always flawless. The next person through the door would be security. Dr. Mercer moved fast when his authority was threatened. He'd have already called risk management, already built the paper trail, already prepared the case that would stand up in any hearing because hospital policy existed for reasons and reasons were always easier to defend than outcomes. She sat beside Matthew's bed and waited for the end to begin. The complaints arrived like precision-guided strikes. Within an hour of Matthew's color returning to normal, of the hiss of air escaping the needle settling into the terrible silence of survival, Dr. Mercer sat in his office on the 16th floor and began building his case. Policy Section 7.3.2, Invasive Procedures Without Physician Authorization. The words looked perfect on paper. He had them printed, highlighted, distributed. His hands moved with the care of a surgeon placing sutures, each complaint filed with meticulous attention to bureaucratic detail. Risk management first. Then the State Nursing Board. Then hospital administration with copies marked for legal counsel. He was building a wall out of regulations, and walls were what protected men like him from people like her. The paper trail grew thicker by the afternoon. He summoned witnesses, 2 orderlies from the code team, the respiratory therapist, a resident who'd been present when Natalie finished the procedure. Not all of them wanted to sign statements. The resident hesitated for a full minute, pen hovering over the form. Dr. Mercer's eyes didn't leave him. She endangered this patient, he said quietly. Are you really going to protect someone who practices medicine without a license? The pen went down. The statement was signed. By 5 o'clock, Dr. Mercer had 4 documented accounts of Natalie Hayes exceeding her scope of practice, each one dated and witnessed, each one another brick in the fortress he was constructing. By 6, he'd scheduled her termination hearing for the following Monday. But he wasn't done waiting. He invoked the obscure regulation that required immediate suspension for any staff member who exceeded scope of practice resulting in patient contact, a rule so old that even the hospital administrator had to search the policy manual to confirm it existed. It existed. That was the beautiful part. Every regulation Dr. Mercer had cited was real. Every complaint was technically valid. He wasn't breaking rules, he was weaponizing them with the precision of a man who understood that institutions protected their own far better when the attacks came from within the system, not against it. At 7:15, he walked to Matthew's room with 2 security guards flanking him like lieutenants. Natalie was adjusting the boy's pillow, checking the O2 monitor, 88, stable, climbing steadily. She didn't see them enter. She wouldn't have reacted if she had. That was the thing about her that made Dr. Mercer's jaw tighten every time he watched her move through the unit. No fear. No hesitation. No apologetic downward glance when challenged. Just that steady presence, that muscle memory of competence, that infuriating calm. Captain Hayes, he said. The title landed like a thrown stone. Natalie's hand stopped moving. Her eye shifted to him, not quickly, not with alarm, just a measured refocus. You're being placed on immediate suspension effective now. Scope of practice violation. Excessive patient contact without physician authorization. You'll surrender your badge and credentials and leave the building within the next 30 minutes. It wasn't a request. It was a command. I understand, she said. Her voice was flat, professional, stripped of everything but the essential syllables. She turned to Matthew and signed something, quick, fluid, practiced, and the boy's face shifted into concern. She touched his shoulder and turned back to Dr. Mercer. "I need 5 minutes to gather my things." "Security will escort you," Mercer said. She nodded as if he'd told her the weather forecast. The orderlies shifted. One of them, the respiratory therapist who'd watched her take the needle and know exactly where to insert it, who'd seen the kid's oxygen saturation climb from the impossible to the barely survivable, looked at his shoes. Natalie clipped her badge from her waist without ceremony and placed it on the bedside table. The plastic laminate caught the fluorescent light like a small mirror. The locker room was empty at 7:43 p.m. on a Thursday. Her shift had ended at 3, but her life had ended at 3:22 when Matthew's lung collapsed and she made the choice that any battlefield medic would have made, the choice that had no room for policy manuals or hospital bylaws, only the choice between action and watching a child die. Her locker smelled like antiseptic and something else, something older, the faint ghost of combat boot leather and desert sun. She opened it and began removing the careful constructions of her civilian life. 3 uniforms, folded the military way. Spare shoes, polished to a shine that no nurse would ever need. A small cardboard box of personal items that had never actually been personal. And then her hands found it, the jacket hanging in the back corner, the one she wore on cold shifts when the hospital's air conditioning turned malicious. She pulled the jacket down and felt the weight of it, the familiar texture of the nylon outer shell. Her fingers found the inside seam and touched the patch she'd sewn there herself 8 months ago. Faded now. Nearly invisible. An Air Force unit patch showing 3 small arrows stacked vertically, the insignia of a medical outfit that officially never existed. The patch that marked her as Captain Natalie Hayes, not as a nurse named Natalie who'd appeared out of nowhere with an impeccable record and a closed mouth. The exposure meant mission failure. Colonel James Pierce was still sitting vigil in the ICU waiting room, still unaware that his son's nurse had been assigned by Pentagon intelligence to monitor his fitness for command, to investigate the irregularities in his Ramadi unit's supply reports, the whispers that something corrupt had taken root in his chain of command. 8 months of observation. 8 months of watching the man's face in the hospital corridor, of assessing his character through the lens of how he treated his profoundly deaf son. And in one moment, in the space of a single decision to save a child's life, all of it had been dismantled. Her cover was gone. Her access was ended. Captain Natalie Hayes had just killed the mission with a 14-gauge needle and the instincts of a combat medic who'd spent 3 tours learning that some rules existed to be broken. She held the jacket to her chest. Around her, the locker room hummed with the sound of nothing, no voices, no footsteps, just the distant ventilation system breathing like a sleeping animal. The cardboard box of her life sat open on the bench. She should put the jacket in. She should walk out. She should call the Pentagon liaison and report mission compromise. Instead, at 8:06 p.m., she found herself sitting in a diner called Murphy's across the street from Savannah Regional, the kind of place that stayed open at 3 in the morning for insomniacs and nurses on graveyard shifts. The coffee was old enough to taste like the pot it had been sitting in since breakfast. She ordered it anyway and sat in the vinyl booth by the window and watched the rain begin to fall in heavy sheets that turned the streetlights into watercolor smears of gold. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark glass. A woman in a scrub top pulled inside out, the hospital markings hidden, with wet hair and eyes that had seen too many impossible choices. The coffee grew cold. She didn't drink it. She held the cup between her hands and felt the warmth leaching out of it, the way heat always escaped in the end, the way everything eventually cooled down to the temperature of the room around it. 12 years. The realization came with the clarity of a surgical strike. 12 years since she'd enlisted at 22, before the wars had names, before she understood that competence would make her useful and useful would mean she could never stop. 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. 2 Purple Hearts from Ramadi, shrapnel that had caught her shoulder in a convoy ambush, a bullet that had missed her femoral artery by the width of her finger. And for what? To sit in a diner at 3:17 a.m. and watch her military career dissolve because she'd saved a child's life. Maybe they were right, she thought. The 15 doctors who dismissed Matthew's breathing concerns. The hospital administrators who'd built policies to protect themselves rather than to heal. The voice in her head that sounded like her commanding officer, "Don't let emotions cloud the mission." She'd violated protocol. She'd exceeded her authority. She'd acted like a soldier when she was supposed to act like a nurse. And now the mission was compromised, and Captain Natalie Hayes was sitting alone in a fluorescent-lit diner with a cup of coffee going cold, and there was no one to call who could fix this without ending everything. Her eyes burned. Her hand stayed steady. She reached into the jacket pocket, the one she'd never removed, and pulled out the unit patch. Held it between her fingers where the diner's harsh light turned it into something fragile and small. 3 arrows. The symbol of a medical unit that had treated 847 casualties during the surge, that had lost 4 soldiers to IEDs, that had earned a citation for extraordinary heroism that only 4 people in the entire unit had ever been allowed to read. And she was about to throw it away. To let it blow into the Savannah rain and disappear into the street drains where it could dissolve alongside her career, her mission, everything she'd been trained to protect. The patch was so close to the window. The glass was cold against her hand. One motion. That's all it took to end the second identity, the one she'd built 8 months ago with different paperwork and a lie that had kept a colonel's son alive. One motion and Captain Natalie Hayes could become someone new again. Someone safer. Someone who'd never heard of Ramadi. She held the patch between her thumb and forefinger and felt the weight of something impossible. Not the weight of the patch itself, that was nothing, microfibers and thread. But the weight of Matthew's face when she'd signed her goodbye, the confusion in his small hands as she backed away, the knowledge that she was leaving him unprotected in a hospital where the chief of pediatrics had just made it clear he considered her a threat. A sound cut through the rain outside. Distant. Growing closer. The low thrum of rotors beating through the Savannah night, still too far away to be certain, but moving in a direction that felt like intention. She froze with the patch still between her fingers. The sound grew louder. And then the diner door opened, bringing a wash of rain-cold air and the sound of boots on linoleum, boots that moved with the precise cadence of a military formation. 1, 2, 3, 4. Steady. Coming toward her table. The helicopter's rotor wash shook the ER windows as the transport doors burst open. Natalie stood at the supply station, organizing 4 lines with mechanical precision, when the voice came from Trauma Bay 3, a voice she hadn't heard in 8 years, speaking in Arabic. Angel of Ramadi. She turned. The man on the gurney was skeletal, pale from chemotherapy, but his eyes locked on hers with absolute certainty. An Iraqi translator, now a refugee cancer patient, his chest wrapped in post-surgical dressing. His hand trembled as he pointed. You saved my brother. You sang to him in the dust. I know you. The room went quiet. Nurses froze mid-task. Monitors beeped into the silence. Natalie's hands continued moving, steady, precise. She didn't acknowledge the man. She didn't flinch. She turned back to her supply cart and checked the next 4 bag, her jaw clenching just enough for the orderly beside her to notice. But something had shifted. Someone knew. The threads were unraveling. A Marine Corps liaison was standing in the hallway. Captain Marcus Holloway, dress uniform crisp as a knife edge, had been visiting Colonel Pierce to brief him on unit matters. He'd overheard. His eyes narrowed. He took 2 steps into Trauma Bay 3 and pulled a leather folder from beneath his arm. Captain Natalie Hayes, he said, his voice cutting through the room like a formal declaration. For extraordinary heroism under fire. Treating 43 casualties during a 72-hour siege in Jolan District, Fallujah. April 2016. He read each word with the weight of a medal ceremony. The translator nodded vigorously, tears streaming down his weathered face. Yes. Yes, that is her. That is the one. The ER staff stared. One of the younger nurses dropped a tray of instruments. The sound scattered across tile like scattered shell casings. Natalie stood motionless, her hand still on the fall line, her expression unchanged. She could feel the question marks forming in every eye. She was a nurse. Just a nurse. 8 months at St. Michael's. Quiet. Careful. Competent. But not this. Dr. Mercer burst through the trauma bay curtain, his face already flushed with rage before he'd assessed the situation. He saw the Marine in uniform. He saw the folder. He saw every head in the ER turn toward Natalie Hayes. "Excuse me," he snapped. "This patient requires—" "Stand down, doctor." The voice came from the elevator bank. A 2-star general. Major General Rebecca Thorne, in full dress blues, with 3 stars of a Joint Operations Commander embroidered on her collar. She'd arrived for Colonel Pierce's update, a routine family briefing on his son's medical progress. She'd heard the commotion from the hallway. She walked directly to Natalie without a word, her movements carrying the kind of weight that made the air itself compress. She looked at her face. She looked at the faded unit patch visible through the gap in Natalie's collar, the symbol of 3rd Combat Support Hospital, 82nd Airborne. She saw what everyone else had missed. General Thorne snapped to attention. Her right hand rose to her temple in a perfect salute, a formal gesture of military honor reserved for superiors and the decorated. "Silver Star," she said quietly, her eyes level with Natalie's. 2 purple hearts. The kind of valor that doesn't fit on a hospital badge. Dr. Mercer's face cycled through colors. Red. Purple. A shade that suggested his blood pressure was climbing past safe limits. "What is the meaning of this?" "Security. Now. Remove everyone from this bay who is not hospital personnel." But no one moved. The general was still saluting. Natalie met her eyes and nodded, one small gesture. Not a smile. Not tears. Just acknowledgement. The kind of communication that happened between people who'd operated in spaces where words dissolved into statistics and mission parameters. The general lowered her hand. "Your father is in the waiting room. He asked me to tell you that Matthew's lungs are clear. The procedure you performed saved his life. 43 people in Ramadi. 1 little boy in Savannah. Same skill. Same outcome." She turned to Dr. Mercer, and her voice changed, became the kind of cold that preceded terminations. "Doctor, you're relieved from this patient's case effective immediately. I'll be speaking to your board." Dr. Mercer stammered. His authority had fractured in 6 seconds flat. That night, the video surfaced. A visitor's phone, a casual recording from 2 weeks earlier. The vending machine. Dr. Mercer's voice, loud and contemptuous. "Military nurses think 6 weeks of training makes them doctors. She's practicing medicine without a license, and I'm having security escort her off this floor if she says one more word to my residents." He was laughing. 2 orderlies were laughing. The recording was 17 seconds long and crystal clear. It went viral. 47,000 views by morning. 100,000 by noon. But the rail bomb came from MIT. Dr. Patricia Vance, legend in pediatric trauma, medical school mentor to Dr. Mercer 30 years prior, saw the video at 2:13 p.m. and issued a public statement that would kill careers. "I don't know this man anymore. The arrogance, the cruelty, it contradicts everything medicine represents. I'm requesting the medical board conduct a full fitness review. I'm also requesting hospital administration clarify their protocols for physician misconduct." She didn't name him directly. She didn't need to. The video did that. Within hours, #Mercer vending machine was trending. Local news picked it up. The state nursing board called. The hospital's legal team shut down. They knew what was coming. 3 months later, Dr. Mercer's hospital privileges were revoked. His medical license was flagged for mandatory retraining. His reputation, built over 23 years, dissolved in the time it took to process an ethics complaint. He took a position teaching CPR basics at Coastal Community College, 7 miles from St. Michael's. $18 an hour. Standing in a fluorescent-lit classroom with plastic dummies and mannequins, setting up scenarios for nursing students who'd seen his viral video and recognized him immediately. A student once asked, "Are you the doctor from that vending machine video?" He'd flinched. He'd been flinching ever since. But that day, the day the revelation came, belonged to someone else. Natalie wore her class A uniform for the first time in 8 months. Dark blue tunic with the silver star pinned below her ribbons. 2 purple heart decorations catching the light. She knelt beside Matthew's bed in his recovery room, where the boy was watching cartoons, his small body finally breathing without mechanical assistance. She smiled at him, the first real smile she'd allowed herself in weeks. Matthew's hands moved. ASL. His little fingers forming words, "Thank you. You fix me." Colonel Pierce stood behind her, his weathered hand resting on her shoulder. Behind him stood General Thorne. Behind her stood Captain Holloway and 7 members of the 82nd Airborne Medical Unit, all in dress blues, all witnessing the moment when Captain Natalie Hayes was finally, completely, undeniably seen. The boy's chest rose and falling with steady rhythm. Oxygen saturation at 98%. Heart rate normal. The breathing that 15 specialists had dismissed as impossible, breathing that Dr. Mercer had fought against, now sustained by the skill of a woman he'd tried to destroy. Colonel Pierce leaned down and whispered something only she could hear, "Welcome home, Captain." The trembling started then, not fear, but restraint. The strain of holding back 8 months of protocol, 8 months of invisibility, 8 months of being just a nurse while carrying the weight of something far heavier. She'd been placed at St. Michael's to monitor a superior officer suspected of compromised loyalty during combat operations. That mission was complete. The investigation found nothing. Colonel Pierce was clean. His devotion to his son, absolute. His integrity, intact. But Natalie wasn't leaving. She stood, still in uniform, and looked at General Thorne. "With your permission, I'd like to request reassignment to the VA wing. Permanent detail. Trauma and recovery." The general smiled, the first time any of them had seen her smile. "Captain, the VA wing didn't exist until this morning. The board approved it 4 hours ago. Thought you might want to build something from scratch." She extended her hand. Natalie took it. Formal. Military. A contract written in a single handshake. The next morning, Natalie walked into St. Michael's wearing scrubs again. Not the Air Force uniform. Not the captain's insignia. Just the pale blue fabric, the badge with her name, the unit patch now visible through her collar, not hidden anymore. Visible. She checked on Matthew first. The boy was eating solid food, his small fingers sticky with honey. His father sat beside him, finally sleeping, the first real sleep he'd had in 3 months. She walked the corridors. Other nurses nodded. Not with deference. Not with fear of hierarchy. With respect. One of them, a young woman Natalie had helped train, pulled her aside. Dr. Mercer didn't say goodbye. He just cleared his office. Left his white coat on his chair. Natalie nodded and continued. She had 12 patients to assess. 2 post-surgical recoveries. 1 pediatric pneumonia case. 1 elderly Marine with sepsis. 1. The elevator doors opened. A woman in a leather jacket, holding 2 cups of coffee, caught Natalie's eye. They'd met once, briefly, in the parking lot. A veteran. A therapist. Someone who understood the weight of coming home. The woman held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then set 1 coffee cup on the nurse's station. Left it there. Walked away without speaking. Natalie picked it up. Her name was written on it in neat script. Below it, a single question mark. She almost smiled. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The incredible discipline it took to stay quiet when you could command. To serve when you could lead. To heal quietly when the world wanted you to be famous. Scars tell stories. The ones on her skin from Ramadi. The ones invisible beneath her uniform. The ones carved into her by watching a 7-year-old breathe when everyone said he couldn't. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your history, if you've ever let someone believe you were smaller than you actually are, share this story. And tell us, what would you do if the world finally saw you as you truly are? Comment below.